Well, good evening, Shaker community, and welcome to tonight's webinar. Tonight's webinar is a focus on our efforts around detracking, and we have two very special guests who are going to share a little bit about our plans to really measure our progress around detracking through some deep data and analysis work. I'm John Moore, Curriculum and Instruction Director, but tonight I simply serve as your host for two esteemed guests, Dr. Peters and Dr. Thornton, who will be sharing around their areas of expertise and how we're going to benefit from that to best understand our progress with detracking. Let's begin. Tonight's agenda includes a brief overview to add some context for detracking and how we've gotten to this important place. Then I'll shift over to Dr. Thornton, who will tell us a little bit about her plans for a mixed method study on site this spring. We'll shift over to Dr. Scott Peters, who will follow up with a purely quantitative analysis using our NWEA MAP scores. And we'll wrap up tonight's evening with possibly the most important part, which is responding to your very important questions in the chat. We welcome you to put questions in the chat at any time that they strike you. We will hold those to the end, at which time I will bring those to Drs. Thornton and Dr. Peters. Let's begin with a little bit of an overview. For those of you who may be just learning about detracking, it's hard to talk about without thinking a little bit about what tracks are. And tracks are simply this idea that when schools level courses, when they create different courses for the same content standards, but rank it as in core and enriched or core and honors, what inevitably happens is that the district creates tracks. And by and large, what a young person might be in as early in Shaker's history as fifth grade, oftentimes can predict that student's future academic experience, their whole trajectory, their path, their track. In fifth grade, depending on what math class you were, we could make a strong prediction as to whether you might be in calculus, whether you could be in our IB diploma program, and so much more. Part of detracking is really uprooting that inequitable practice and leveling up curriculum and instruction so that we have universally high expectations for all students. And if we do it right, you will see courses like the IB diploma program, advanced placement, college credit plus, or career tech ed classes. We're actually going to see a broader, more representative basis in our student body who partake in these rigorous, engaging pathways. We do get that question a lot. We have folks ask, they want to know, hey, you've detracked. Does that mean you're getting rid of some of your most rigorous courses at the high school? Certainly not. And in fact, when we're doing detracking well, we know that more students are going to have access to those programs than ever before. A little bit of research that informed why this was so important. And I wanted to share this with you tonight because part of our impetus, part of why this research and data conversation is so important is because we want to know that what others have experienced with detracking and the benefits that they've gained, are those playing out, and to what extent are they playing out in the Shaker Heights City Schools? A couple of key points. Number one, research suggests that leveled courses or tracks are oftentimes more reflective of privilege than they are academic ability. We were separating or segregating children based on privilege, not necessarily their past academic performance or potential. Another idea, when we combine courses, or in Shaker's case, level up, what can often happen is that students who were previously in the lower track, or what we might have called a core class, they grow exponentially without negatively impacting students who were previously on the higher track. There's also evidence that once you've desegregated those courses, more positive peer interactions and social networking occur, which speaks directly to our key performance indicator around a sense of belonging. And finally, inclusive resources can facilitate a more equitable distribution of resources. That includes our expert teachers. We ensure that all students have equitable access to resources That includes human capital. Now, I would leave it there, except for I was at a state meeting just last week in which this research was shared with me, and I thought it was important enough to share with all of you. And while it's not explicitly about detracking, I think you'll see why I had to share it momentarily. What the New Teacher Project found in 2018, they did a broad study, and they discovered that when students are given grade level work, performance was pretty similar, regardless of whether that classroom was made up of students mostly of color, you see that on the left bar there, or the student was made up mostly of white students. And this was a case study of segregated courses, mostly students of color, mostly white. What was happening with grade level work and performance? And what they discovered was that all else equal, students were performing about the same amount. That parity disappears when you actually look at who is getting grade level work. And this to me really speaks to why detracking was so important for us. In classes with mostly students of color, what the New Teacher Project found was that nearly 40% of students never received a single grade level assignment. That reinforces that conversation we had around how important it is that we have high expectations for all of our students. In this case, what they found was that 40% never even had a chance at grade level assignments, whereas that same dilemma was only true in 12% of classes with mostly white students. This to me spoke to how important this work is. It also spoke to me how important it is that we pursue this data challenge. We did an entire superintendent series in the fall where community members were able to join and ask questions of a panel. We invited folks in to observe ELA and math classes. And oftentimes we heard from our community how important it was that we know we're on the right path. What we've been wrestling with is a true data challenge, however. What we know is that Shaker's initiative to detrack shares a timeline with the impacts of the pandemic. And to what extent our students' current performance on learning and teaching is intertwined with both of these factors and probably more. One of our challenges that we know from a national assessment of educational progress is that there has been a general decrease in reading and math performance across the nation and, in fact, the world. We've also seen that that decrease has impacted historically marginalized communities even more extremely and in more prolonged ways than their white peers. This leads us to this question. We know as a district, our MAP scores are coming back up to pre-pandemic levels. We see our literacy data improving and our math data improving. But amidst a widespread downturn in performance data, how well are we improving? How quickly, how swiftly, and how has detracking impacted that learning and teaching? This is an incredibly challenging question, and I'm honored to now introduce to you someone who's going to help us untangle that incredibly challenging question. It's with great honor that I now introduce Dr. Maggie Thornton, who's going to tell us a little bit about how she's going to help us figure this out. Dr.
Hi,
Thornton?
everyone. Yes, thank you so much for having me, John, and just the entire Shaker Heights community. It's really nice to be with you all this evening. I am coming to you from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I live, and I work at Rowan University, which is just over the water in New Jersey. And I study tracking and detracking. I serve currently as the American Educational Research Association's chairperson of the Tracking and Detracking Special Interest Group, so a group of researchers across the country who are looking at issues of how we sort students. And I also recently published a book on detracking. It came out of my dissertation work, which looked at 4 different high schools that were in different phases of their detracking journey. And what I provided for each of those high schools is what I'm hoping to provide for you all as well, which is largely a descriptive study. So my objective will be to learn how folks are thinking and feeling about the detracking initiatives in Shaker Heights. And then also to describe a little bit from a statistical perspective as well, what we're seeing in terms of student enrollment in schools overall, but also in specific classes. My outcome for that will be a report delivered to your district leadership team. And how they choose to use that is up to them, of course, but I hope that they will make that information available to you all as appropriate to know where you are as a community. And then also, I do plan to write as well a journal article. I am a researcher, so I live in the publish or perish world that I know many of you all are familiar with from your own backgrounds. So there'll also be that work. So the quantitative aspects, as I mentioned, will be some look around enrollment, course enrollment, students' race, ethnicity, special education status, other factors that we know from previous research can impact students' ability to access higher level classes. And then qualitatively, I will want to speak to as many of you all as possible while I am there with you in Shaker. We'll do some one-on-one interviews. We'll also have some focus groups because that'll be a way to maximize the time that I can hear from folks. I'll take all of that data back with me, go through a pretty rigorous coding process where I'll look at everyone's transcripts. That you will be anonymous, your role in the district, and I mean that broadly, like I might say a parent with a student at this school said this, for instance, right? But it would never be anyone named or identified. I'll take all of that back. I'll code what I find and I'll put it together in the report, and that I will then turn over to John and his team. The timeline, is that is that decided or?
I think we're pretty confident, Dr. Thornton.
Okay, so I'm planning to be with you all in about mid-May as state testing ramps down. So this will give you all an opportunity to sit with the findings over the summer and think about what information you want to glean from this report as you move forward as a community in helping all students to reach their potential. I do come, to this. I believe that detracking can work, but I think that it takes a lot of different variables in different contexts. Students require different things. So my goal is gonna be to collect as much information from the community as possible and then report back to the school district leadership to then help them continue to make choices that will be in the best interest of all students.
Dr. Thornton, I really appreciate that. I did want to share your question around the timeline. Dr. Thornton, Dr. Peters, and I met with some internal stakeholders, representation group of teachers and administrators, folks who were really on the ground floor of deciding what some of this research could look like. And Dr. Thornton, do you mind sharing a little bit about their perspectives of why they felt like they wanted this to be this spring, why it felt
Absolutely.
urgent?
Yeah, so I'm here in this case working for you all. I'm interested in providing the best information that I can with my research skills and background. And so to that end, I did open it up to the team and I said, I see a few different avenues we could take. I could come, sort of after the state testing windows close. That has certainly, has the potential to be a time of year that folks are kind of starting to power down and maybe not be as ready to go with answering questions. I could come over the summer and talk to folks, but people are traveling, you're in, you're out. So that's probably not the best time. And then we thought about maybe at the beginning of the school year, give everyone a few weeks to get settled, and then I could come and hear from folks. But there was a really strong feeling that waiting is not a good idea, that would not be an ideal time, because if you think about how districts tend to operate, summer is the planning time, the time when everyone can kind of take a step back, reflect on the school year, think about where you would like to go in the future. And so if I can get you all a report pretty early in the summer, then that'll give the leadership team plenty of time to reflect and also take action on the findings.
Dr. Thornton, thank you very much for that. I have two questions right off that I know our community is inquiring about, and then we'll kick it over to Dr. Peters. Dr. Thornton, our community is so committed to hearing and frankly, getting better at hearing from all of our community. How do you see yourself connecting with folks when you're doing these interviews? How can we be good partners in making sure that you're hearing from even our most marginalized members of our community so that this is truly representative of everybody's experience?
That's a great question. So I don't think that qualitative interviews can ever capture everyone's thoughts, perfectly. Folks leave things unsaid. Folks are available, they're not available. But it is really absolutely important, as you say, to reach out to members of the community, particularly those who are often not heard. And so to that end, I will rely on you all as partners. I plan to make myself available all day. So I'll be available in schools. Teachers can come and speak to me during their planning periods, but also be available after school and in the evenings as well. So folks who are working a schedule where they're free in the evening are able to come. If there are other community groups, I know sometimes churches can be, or other religious organizations can be strong partners for a school district in a way to reach families who might not otherwise be available. And so we can work with those partners as well. And also just, being honest, being frank, and knowing, I'm not here to write a report that says, oh, everything's going great, don't change a thing. I don't think that's the case. That would not be a good use of my time or the community's time. I'm really invested in hearing about what's working, but also what's not working and what you would like to see change in the future.
Maggie, you teed up that follow-up question beautifully. I've been contacted by some of our educators who have ideas that they have experiences to inform how we might improve our practices. You spoke to this a little bit, but if I'm a teacher and I'm thinking, gosh, I've got these ideas, how do you see that playing out in your research?
Absolutely. So my goal for the report that I provide to you all is going to also take a series of recommendations. So something I hear a lot in my research working with school districts that are undertaking detracking is, oh, and we're one of the few schools that are doing this. And that's just not the case. There's a wide swath of schools across the US trying to figure out how to decouple students' demographic factors from their class assignment and their access to rigorous education. And so there is a body of research of what's happened in these schools, not just in my dissertation, but I built on many decades of work. And so as an opportunity to say, oh, I heard from teachers, they're struggling with this particular instructional task, and then looking at the research and saying, oh, well, other school districts have handled it in this way, and they have found, this has helped students, or that it was a terrible idea and they abandoned it. Don't do that. So that's something else that I'm also going to be thinking about in terms of the report that I provide to you all, are some ideas about where to go next, grounded in the research that we have on detracking.
Dr. Thornton, thank you so very much. I'm certain we'll come back to you at the end with some great questions from our community.
Great.
I'm seeing some excellent ones come through on the chat. Let's give you a break, however, and introduce our next partner, Dr. Scott Peters.
Hello, everyone. I had to find my unmute. Can you hear me? So good evening. Nice to virtually see you all as close as we can get, I suppose. So as John said, my name is Scott Peters. I'm the Director of Research Consulting Partnerships at NWEA, so publishers of the map assessment that you all use. And when John first contacted me, it was related to this project. It was related to this question of, we've undertaken this effort over the last several years, and we want to get a better sense on whether or not it's working. And, kind of all researchers are kind of interested in the same question is, what kind of data or information, or who can we talk to, or what analyses can we do that give us some kind of cause and effect information? And the challenge for most, well, all map partners, just like yourself, is that if you go and look at your student data, you can essentially compare it to two things. And those of you that are a little bit more assessment oriented or a little bit more assessment nerds in the audience will be familiar with this. You can compare a student's performance on a spelling test or an ACT or an MCATs if you want. You can compare that to some kind of fixed criterion of skills. So you want to see that students can do things A, B, and C. They can fix comma splices. They can do two-digit addition. That's comparing what a student can do to a baseline set of skills. And you can certainly do that. And we at NWA, we make these they're called linking studies, where you can compare where students are to Ohio State standards. So great, that's one set of interpretation. Then we have what are called normative comparisons, which ignores what the kids can do and just compares one student's performance to some other group of students' performance. The challenge is that most map partners, in terms of that normative comparison, all you can do is compare how a student did to what we call our 2020 norms, our normative data set, which is made up of about 11 million students. Mostly it was from pre-pandemic years. We're in the middle of kind of updating those to take into account COVID learning loss right now. And those are very useful if you want to compare, how one of your third graders in math did to other third graders in math nationally. But if you want to actually evaluate some kind of curricular or policy change, they're not as helpful, because most schools aren't like a mirror image of the national average, right? Like there's not a lot of schools out there that just happen to be a perfect snapshot of the distribution of the country in terms of their size and their achievement, the percentage of students of color, all those things. Just in every way, they are exactly average. They probably exist, but they're not very common. So when you look at the comparison to norms, you think, well, that's not that interesting. We're a different kind of district. We've got this kind of community. So we need a different frame of reference. So that leads us to something NWA developed a very long time ago. We called it the Similar Schools Report at the time. And now we kind of refer to it as a virtual comparison group, so which is what VCG stands for. And what we essentially do is we create a custom comparison group for every one of your students. So the long and short of it is that we take every single one of your students, say for the 22-23 school year, and we go into our database of close to 1 billion students, or 1 billion test scores, I should say, and create a customized comparison group for every single kid. So picture a student in your district. That student is going to be compared to about 50 other students who are matched in terms of their starting achievement. So if they scored a 218 in the fall of 7th grade, we're going to look for other students that scored a 214 in the start of 7th grade. If the student goes to a school that is 30% free and reduced lunch, we're going to grab only students with that 217 who also attend a school that's 30% free and reduced lunch. If that school is what we call an urbanicity category of a large suburb, we're only going to grab students that attend schools that are large suburbs. So that way, instead of comparing your students to, students from, rural Montana or from, New York City or, urban Boston or something like that, we're comparing your students to students who are as most similar to them as we can get. We don't have everything. We're not going to match them perfectly, but whatever variables we have, we're going to match them as closely as we can get. Because then what we'll do with those matches is that creates a comparison distribution. So an average score for the fall, an average score for the spring, and also what is typical growth from fall to spring. So we will have that comparison group, and we will compare every one of your students' growth from, say, fall to spring of 7th grade to the typical growth from the fall to spring of 7th grade in that custom normative group. And, it just so happens that we did this a bit earlier this week. We're kind of ahead of ourselves a little bit. We were working out some of the kinks. And so we just happened to have run your analysis, kind of a back of a napkin kind of analysis. It's not kind of the finalized one, but just to give you kind of a sense of how this worked. So there were about 2,500 comparisons that happened. So if you take all your 5th through 8th graders, that probably comes out to something like 1,200 students. You double it for math and reading, because we're looking at math and reading, and that comes out to about 2,500 students. There were only 6, so 3 kids, but math and reading. There were only 6 kids out of those 2,500 who didn't have 51 valid comparisons. And the reason why we couldn't find 51 valid comparisons is because these are very unique individuals. These are individuals that were scoring at the college readiness level in 5th grade. So outscoring 99% of 12th graders in 5th grade. Some of you maybe know who these kids are. I don't know who they are, but you probably know who they are. And these were also students that were scoring, a 160 in 8th grade. And a 160 is really kind of knocking around kindergarten proficiency. So these were kids that were at the extremes. They had a very odd number of what we call instructional days. So we also match kids on the number of days between their fall and spring testing occasion. And we just couldn't find any matches that were that extreme, that had that exact instructional days. So we only got 31 comparison kids for that kid. So, that's still usually pretty good. But I bring it up just to give you a sense of this is something we do fairly regularly. What's unique in your all's instance is just kind of some of the customization that we're doing. But in the end, you'll be able to look at reports where you can break students out by grade. So you'll be able to say, for example, in an ideal sense, going back to what Dr. Thornton was talking about, I think in an ideal world, what we would see is that the average growth for your students was above the 50th percentile. Because what that would mean to me is that compared to these similar these kids that were out there in the ether but didn't undergo your change, presumably that just by happenstance, that your students grew more than was typical in that comparison group. Or maybe that's not what we'll find. Maybe we'll find they were at the 45th percentile, so kind of about the same, and then maybe it didn't have that big an effect. We don't know, but that's really the outcome variable that we'll be getting, is you'll be able to look at it by gender, you'll be able to look at it by race, you'll be able to look at it by grade, and you'll be able to look at what their growth was like across the school year. I think mostly we're focusing on the 22-23 school year, and how their growth compared to their customized normative groups. The biggest caveats, this is, I'm a researcher, so I have absolutely no problem poking holes in all of my own analytic designs. Usually us researchers are really good at critiquing our own work. What is this not going to tell you? This is not going to tell you if students felt more welcome or included in kind of the detract classrooms. That's an outcome we're not measuring. We're measuring math and achievement growth as measured by one test. It's not going to tell you the perhaps affective or motivational benefits where, because I was now included in more rigorous content, I felt myself as more of a math learner than I would have in the detract classrooms. We're not going to get at that. This is going to be one data point that we can provide the district. You all are really fortunate in that you also have a very good comparison data point through Dr. Thornton's work that you can kind of, bring it together for a really holistic decision. The other thing is this is on a continuum of kind of cause and effect. On one outcome, we say, oh, well, kids are scoring higher in the spring than they used to, therefore tracking worked. That's really bad causal inference, because who knows what happened? A million things could have happened. On the other extreme is a randomized trial where you put students in tracked or detract classrooms based on a lottery. We're probably not going to do that either. Yeah, I'm not suggesting that, just to be clear. And we don't get a lot of random experiments in education. This is kind of somewhere in the middle where we are controlling for a lot of relevant factors, and we're trying to make as apples to apples comparison as we can. But of course, these kids are still different human beings. It's possible that just due to happenstance, we're seeing some differences that aren't due to the detracking, but it's definitely more towards kind of the causal inference than just a correlational study or just that you'd get with the norms. If there's any, perhaps, research nerds in the audience, sometimes how we describe this is a version of propensity score matching. Again, most of you who have better things to do, that won't mean anything, but if there are some research nerds in the audience, this is kind of a simpler version of propensity score matching. You might hear me say simpler and think, well, why are we getting the simpler version? Well, the reason we don't do true propensity score matching is because then I can't actually tell you to whom your kid is being compared. So in a real propensity score model, we take all these variables and throw them in a blender, and they're all distilled down to a single number. And that's how we match kids, is based on that single number. But I can't actually look at one of your students and say, oh, that student was compared to other low-income students or other students of color or other eighth graders or whatever. We can't say that. So the benefit of the VCG is we think it's a little bit easier to interpret, because I can very clearly tell you, oh, yes, this student with a 218 was only compared to other students who got a 218. Like, I can show you those kids. I can show you their scores, whereas I can't do that with like a true propensity score matching. Trying to think if there's other, how else would I critique this? Oh, this is something that John has brought up a couple times and is absolutely true. We don't necessarily know if those 51 kids were in schools that were like strict tracking math curricula, or I guess the most detracked schools in the history of schools. What we know is that they're being selected at random aside from the matching criteria. But I think it's very likely that maybe out of 51, there's a couple that maybe you got 2 kids in those 51 that their districts just happen to also detrack at the exact same time as you all. It's totally possible. We don't know that. But I don't think that's a very large threat to validity, because what are the odds that they just happen to do it at the exact same time as you all? So I think it's fairly unlikely, but the best way to think of those comparison groups is like a cross-section of schools matched on the comparisons that we already talked about. But we can't rule out that there's maybe some in there that detract at the same time. Since we know, as I know Dr. Thorne has talked about, we do know that it's you are not the only folks that have undertaken this effort.
Dr. Peters,
Yeah.
very much appreciated. We're going to shift over to general Q&A, and we've got a chat full of some excellent questions. Before I open it up broadly, I want to follow up with one specifically for you, Dr. Peters. There's a question in the chat. It talks about the time it takes from your perspective to really see a difference when you're doing an initiative like this. There's this question of, I mean, from a research standpoint, do you think we're going to see a difference? We're 2 years or so into this process. Is this something that we should be thinking about in a repeated way or over time?
There is a kind of running rule of thumb, kind of in like the educational policy research community, that the average administrator lasts like 18 months to 2 years, and the average educational intervention takes 3 to 5 years to start seeing results, which is one of the challenge, because everybody comes in with kind of their policy focuses, which is great, but it takes a lot of years to work out the kinks. So I would say if this has been going on for 2 or 3 years, the first year was people just finding out where the pencils were. It's really working out the kinks. Maybe by the 3rd year, you're starting to see it implemented as we really want it to be. The challenge there is that means kids have had 1 year of that in their entire, say, 5-8 educational experience. So even if that 1 year was really effective, will it show up, or is it going to be kind of watered down with all the other years? So I do think you might just start to see some of the differences. It's absolutely something I would want to look at after a couple more years, especially for maybe when you start to see kids that, their entire 6, 7, 8 experience was in this more detract environment, as opposed to 5 and 6 were the old version, and now 7, 8 was the new version. You kind of average out and don't see as much. So, it'll be interesting to see. I think you might just see some initial differences if it's really having an effect, but probably you're looking more at like 4 or 5 years before it's going to start showing up, which is frustrating.
That is, and it's also really important why we have you two in on the ground floor, so that we have a baseline understanding of where we are today so we know what to do to get to tomorrow. Folks in the audience, you've been pumping questions into the chat. We invite you to continue to do so. I'm going to pitch a couple to both of you. I welcome you to take them as you see them. Some I think will apply to both, some to one or the other. So I'm very much appreciative to your flexibility and your perspective and insight into some of these interesting questions. Here's one for you. We've heard about both studies, and there are things that we need to be conscious about that may not appear on something like a MAP test. How are we going to capture information about the learning experiences of children who maybe regardless of their MAP score are bored or are really struggling? Can you tell between these sorts of things as we're crunching the numbers from a data standpoint?
So I'll take that one first, I think, because Dr. Peters will say, I assume, no, we don't measure that on MAPS does not. But I think they sometimes get some interesting data on how quickly kids click through. That's something I've always wanted to know about. I was a teacher in a math district, so I have a lot of questions. But my work is going to be open to students whose parents consent for them to talk to me. So if your child is, falling in one of those groups and you're fine with their participation, then, if you are willing to sign the consent form for their information to anonymously be included, then I very much want to hear from them. I think student voice is probably the most important piece of this work, the experiences that students are having and how they're feeling. They spend 13 years in this environment, and so we definitely want to know what's going on there.
The things that I can add about about the MAP data, one is as Dr. Thornton mentioned, and some of you maybe have experienced this already, but so MAP tests do flag students who are what we call disengaged or who are engaged in rapid guessing. And so just imagine the time it takes to answer any given item. There's a distribution. Some kids take 30 seconds, some kids take 60 seconds. When kids answer at the tails, so mostly at one tail, so very quickly, they answer a word problem in 8 seconds. We flag that item. If they do it a couple times in a row, literally a picture of a sloth comes up with a stop sign and tells them to slow down, and they can't continue until the teacher comes over and actually enters a code, and then they continue because we try to get them to slow down. And the goal is to get them to give their max performance, is the assumption underlying all assessments, is this assumption of max performance. So that is flagged in any MAP test, is one thing I can say. We don't necessarily flag it in our VCG reports, but at any time you could go look at an individual student and say, yeah, that student got a 180, but was that student disengaged? And just look in the data and you'd be able to see. Now, of course, that's only one little metric of kind of disengaged, and that's on the test. You would also be able to, you'll very much be able to look at growth compared to those reference groups by initial achievement. So you could look and say, okay, are our kids who are starting at the 90th percentile outperforming their 90th percentile comparison group as much as our 10th percentile kids are outperforming theirs? Because that's very plausible. If you've got curriculum that is targeted a certain way, whether it's, especially if this is kind of a, we're detracking by providing advanced options to all kids, then this could be something where it's not as beneficial because the teachers are focused at a very high level. So you will be able to look at kind of performance by initially high or initially low performing students. What the VCG will not be able to speak to at all is, the different context of what is happening in the classrooms. That is kind of nuance that only, the educators who kind of know the context would be able to take into account. That doesn't come into the data anywhere.
Thank you both very much for your responses. Dr. Thornton, we had previously discussed your intentional efforts to get connected with maybe young people or adults in marginalized spaces. There's a specific question in the chat related to how might you make an effort to reach families who maybe chose to leave Shaker because of this initiative or other factors? have you spent any time, or how might we spend time thinking about connecting with those families as well?
That's a great question. I think it is important to capture, every year you're going to have some natural churn, kids move, parents get new jobs, that sort of thing. But folks who are still living in Shaker but choosing to send their kids elsewhere, we definitely want to talk to them. I think that again, this will require some support from the community to create that space. But perhaps in the library, like the public library, if they have some meeting room, some sort of public space where we could offer a focus group if any of those families wanted to come and talk about their experiences and why they made those decisions. I think that would be very valuable information for you all to have.
Agreed. Thank you, Dr. Thornton. Dr. Peters, there's a question here around the longitudinal aspect of what you might be investigating. There's questions around what is our trajectory in a way. Can you talk a little bit about how a VCG, is it more of a snapshot or more of information over time? Can you talk just a little bit about that? Or is that really something the district is going to have to do to stack all this up over time?
I think we have gotten requests from many districts over the years to look at, 3-year growth trends, say, over the entire course of middle school, how do we compare to a virtual comparison group for those same students? The longer the time period, the more number of years, the harder that becomes for two specific reasons. So one is you start exacerbating, or I guess you start biasing your estimates because of summer. So because of kids, experience summer so differently. But perhaps more importantly, as I mentioned before, we match students on the number of days that pass between their fall and their spring assessment. And if I look over real quickly, most of your, I'm only looking at the extreme kids here. I gotta get back. You gotta get back to everybody. All of your students are being matched to those who had fewer than 7 days difference. So, they were tested the 3rd week of school, and then they were tested the 34th day week of school. When we go out to 2-3 years, it becomes essentially impossible to get anywhere close to similar numbers of instructional days. You think about going over 3 years of time, even if each time is only 10 days difference, some kids are now having 30 more days of learning. And, each day of learning can come into something like half a RIT point. So this starts to be a very large difference between, say, your kids and the comparison group. So this is all a very long way of saying we almost always are only looking at one school year growth comparison. We have done it over more than one before, but in some ways you get less causal inference information out of it, because you become a little bit more apples to oranges because those days now are different. You end up comparing kids that have had a different number of days. So it's longitudinal in the sense that we're looking at growth over the course of the year, but it's very much only a 1-year snapshot in time.
Thank you, Dr. Peters. That's not to say that we couldn't run a VCG again at certain intervals. Is that fair to say, though?
Absolutely. It's, on our end, we're kind of in the middle of moving like database systems right now. So we're kind of it's like we're right in the middle of moving houses or something. But going forward, this should be as simple as changing just a couple of parameters and a couple lines of code and then running it again. It's really not a hard thing to do. If you really want to feel special, nobody can get a similar schools report or a VCG right now. You're just a special group that is kind of getting in on the off season. Everybody else has been told they're not available right now. But yes, especially starting this fall, it's not a hard thing to update and just press go again.
Appreciate that very much. Dr. Thornton, one coming your way. You've been down this road before, or certainly you've studied schools that have. What might we see as some recommendations for professional development over the next few years? What are some things that we might discover in this process?
That's a great question. I don't want to poison the well and, introduce like, specifics, but some big ideas. A lot of times I've heard, teachers in particular feeling like, yes, I'm bought into this. I want to have high expectations for all my students. Sounds nice. Then what? So there are a lot of methods around doing that, such as having sort of essential questions or specific objectives that might be the same for all students. And then how do you plan different activities for different students based on their existing skill set without like losing your mind? And you already have such limited time. There are a host of folks who offer that sort of training. Carol Ann Tomlinson is probably the best known name, but there are lots of folks who really have drilled down into what does this actually look like in practice, and I think that's something that we really tend to see. Especially, there are often concerned students who their skill sets just really are already very strong, coming into school from the very beginning. And then this concern that they won't, they'll no longer be challenged. And so how can we give teachers the tools to challenge those students is a question that I hear a lot, and feel very well prepared to go into depth on if that's something that I hear from your teachers. I think that's a really typical one. Assessment. Sometimes assessments might look different for students based on where they are. You might want an assessment that's more challenging. You want to know if a student is able to extend those skills versus designing assessments that we're really interested in making sure students are hitting the grade level targets like you were talking about earlier. So I don't want to get too into the weeds. I know I only have about 10 minutes left. But those are some big picture items that I think we tend to see at schools that are undertaking this work.
I really appreciate that, Maggie. And your note of time, I think, is a good one. There is one theme throughout here that I'm going to open up to both of you. Although, Dr. Peters, you did make a call to the audience for, I think you called it a research nerd. Well, you got a few. We do have a few very specific questions in the chat, probably too specific for us to talk about here tonight. But I'll follow up with you, Dr. Peters. I will get exactly what is in the chat and make sure that we look at these things. But the first line of inquiry presented in that thread, I'll start with the example and then move to the broader question. I think it applies to you both. The audience member comments, overmatching, particularly in the health sciences, for example, has the potential to severely affect validity. How are you statistically assessing for these potential issues? Now, this is, I think, is specifically about the VCG, but Dr. Thornton, I think it applies to you as well. How do we know that these are reliable and valid methods, that what you provide to us is an authentic reflection of where our community stands today?
Well, I'll take that part of the question, and then Dr. Peters, if you want to, you have met a like-minded friend here this evening, so I'll let you handle those questions. Although I'm very interested to hear the answers as well. I think that first of all, it is really important to remember in undertaking any sort of qualitative work, interviews, observations, focus groups, a survey that you decided to put out, you are going to find that people who feel the most are the ones who are responding the most. And that might be people who have some deep issues with the way that detracking is going, and some people who really love it. Like, we're very likely to hear from those two groups. What I hope and plan to bring to the table is a sort of moderating influence on that data, to present it all to you and say, here's what I heard. I didn't hear everyone. I never would make that claim that any sort of qualitative study can be completely objective. Although I do think there is a value in someone who is not necessarily embedded in the community, able to come in and sort of hear things with a little bit of a blank slate. I'm not a parent in Shaker Heights. I'm not a teacher in Shaker Heights. I don't carry any sort of official role. And that can, I think, often help folks open up a little bit. And then also to stay grounded in the research that already exists. What we know about school districts that have had great success with detracking, that they think their systems are strong along a whole host of measures, and they're continuing to do it decades later, and districts that have really struggled to implement detracking in ways that that work for students. And so what I'll be able to do is take what I'm hearing and sort of match that up to the existing research that we have and offer to you all some suggestions of, here are ways you could potentially follow the path of these schools that seem pretty successful and pretty aligned with what you are trying to do. And here are some things I'm hearing that you really want to avoid. But in terms of like, this is an objective way that everyone in Shaker Heights feels, I think it would take, I don't know what it would take, but more than the scope of this particular study.
I wasn't sure if I should jump in. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really great and yes, very kind of, I'm just going to say it nerdy, but in the best possible way. I certainly don't mean that in a negative way. Questions. So something about, there's always kind of a challenge in the broader kind of propensity score bucket, which VCGs fall into, about kind of like internal versus external validity. So internal is getting like really clear cause and effect evidence of, why something happened with one particular kid, versus making sure that that outcome could actually generalize beyond that individual, to a larger group of individuals. Something that we do, I'm going to do I'm not going to give a satisfying answer in terms of the details, but something that we do specifically is we don't have to really deal with that concern very much because of just the size of our data set. So the reason I've been talking about, it's actually 51 students. So the reason we match each student to roughly 51 students is because we've done some simulation studies that whether it's 51 students or 1,000 students, the estimates don't really change. So we see a pretty big drop off in terms of added benefit. And we're not only looking for 51 students, we're creating this massive comparison group and then randomly selecting these 51 students. So you might have 10,000 students, say, that are in the fall of 8th grade, say, that had a RIT score between 210 and 215 or something like that, and also went to schools with 30% FRL eligible students and everything else. And then we select within those bands, of the matching variables, we select the students at random. So this is kind of our attempt to make sure that the students are being compared to as valid a peer group as possible. That's that internal validity cause and effect part, while at the same time not matching them so closely. We're only using a couple variables here. This is actually a very small number of matching criteria for compared to typical actual propensity score studies, because our goal there is to make sure that the results are still kind of generalizable beyond just the nuances of a couple individual kids. That's very much just a high level about how we handle this kind of overmatching problem. If anything, I would have more concerns about the opposite, truthfully, in our VCG approach, that if anything, it's probably undermatching because we only have a couple of criteria and we know there are other relevant covariates that we're not controlling for that affect kids learning in schools. Part of that is because we just don't know everything. We don't have all the data points that you all have on your kids. And part of that is also because we want to avoid the overmatching problem. But again, this is very much a niche topic that I'm probably not doing a good job of answering for either group.
Well, we sincerely appreciate your time tonight, Dr. Thornton, Dr. Peters. Community, thanks for joining us. Thank you for continuing this really important conversation. I think the work of Dr. Thornton, Dr. Peters is really going to help us understand where we are and inform where we want to go with next steps around detracking. I hope that this is the beginning of your relationship with these researchers. Certainly, Dr. Thornton, we are going to get her out in the community, listening and learning from all of you. You'll see her again in May. We'll hope you'll participate then as well. Otherwise, we wish you a wonderful evening. Thanks to our research fellows, our partners. Thank you, community. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you all.